Hey everybody, today I'm going to go through how to perform joins and unions in Python using my favorite package, Pandas. So I have a couple of sample data frames here that I just created. So we have a math class table, so students in a given math class and the number of semesters of school they have completed. And we have a table on GPA information, so the student ID of that student and their corresponding GPA. So quick note here, not all students in this GPA table are found in the math class table based on the student IDs. And not all of these students in the math class table are found in the GPA table. So that when we go to join these tables, the type of join we perform will matter. So let's look at an example. So we're going to use the pandas.merge function, and I'd recommend using .merge, not another popular function, which is .join, because .merge can do everything .join can do and then some. And here's a look at the syntax here. So the default argument is going to be an inner join. And if we have any matching column names, the default will be to join on those matching columns. So in these two tables, we have the student ID in common. So this is the unique identifier of each student. So that's what we're going to use to join on. And you can see that these have the exact same column names. So let's perform our join on these two tables. So pd.merge, and our left table is going to be the data frame math class, right table will be the data frame GPA. And you could switch these two around. It doesn't really matter. This is more as to how you want to format your output. Okay, and now we can use the on argument to specify the column we want to join on, which is going to be student ID. And this works because this is the exact column name of both of those student ID columns. So if one of those columns is not matching, then we'll have to try out something different, which we'll look at in just a second. Now we have the how argument. So what type of join do we want to perform? The default is going to be inner, and we can run this line of code, and here's our output. So inner join means that we are only returning students who are found in both tables. And these are the defaults, again, because Pandas is going to automatically recognize that we have this exact column name in common, and the default on how is inner join. So we'll get the same output if we just run this line of code. All right, so now let's check out a different type of join. So how equals a left join to see only students who are found in the math class table. We can switch this to a right join. And you can take a look actually before we do that. We have these couple students here, Emma and Trevor, who have not completed any full semesters yet. So they do not appear in our GPA table. So those are going to show null values. Switching that to a right join now, we have a few students down here at the bottom, and these are going to be the students who are not in our math class but do have some GPA data from other classes. So null values down here for these columns here that come from the math class table. And then finally, we can perform an outer join to show all students who appear in either table. All right, so here's one last look at the code. And now let's move on to another example. So now I'm going to run this line of code here to change the name of this student ID column in our math class table. So we can run that. And now we no longer have that exact match on the column name. So if we run pandas.merge, math class on the left, GPA on the right, and then on equals student ID, this will give us an error. So because we no longer have those exact matches, we can't use the on argument anymore. And same thing is true if we try the other student ID column name. So we'll get an error. So we can't use on. So instead, we have to use left on equals and right on equals. So left on is going to be the column we're joining on from the left table, which is math class. So that will be this student ID with no underscore. And right on is still going to be that original column name from the GPA table. And of course, we can specify how as usual. So how, let's see, default is going to be an inner join. Run this line of code, and now we get that output again. And in this case, because we don't have that matching column anymore, it is actually going to output multiple student ID columns, but these are going to be matches. So if you want, you can always go ahead and drop a column here. So we can drop student ID, and there's your output. And you can always change how to outer, left, right. You get the point. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and change this back to the original column name. And now let's take a look at an example of joining 3+ tables and doing it all in one line of code. So another way to write a join is to put the left table out in front. So left table dot merge, then right table, and then after that, all the arguments are going to be the same. So how on or left on, right on. So let's bring in this additional third table for student ID and then the corresponding gender. And let's join all 3 of those data frames in one line of code here. So we can write our initial pandas.merge, math class on the left, GPA on the right. We'll say how equals outer, and we don't have to worry about that on argument again. Default will be that matching student ID column, so we can just leave that blank. Run this line of code, and we have an outer join. So essentially, if we look back at our syntax here, the output we just created is essentially our left table. And now we can just add .merge to the right of that line of code to continue on performing another join. So here's our left table right here. And now we can just add .merge, and our right table is going to be gender. And in this case with the gender table, actually all of the student IDs are found in that gender table. So we have all of those 13 students. So it doesn't actually matter which type of join we perform. And the on argument will take the default of that exact match to student ID. So this is all the code we need to run. And now we have joined 3 tables together just in one line of code. All right, so let's move on to unions now. And to perform unions, we're going to use the pandas.concat function. Here's a look at the syntax here. So we have to pass through a list of the arrays, or data frames in this case, that we want to concatenate. And then the access argument is going to specify how to concat. Access equals 0 is the default. This is what you're going to be using the vast majority of the time. And this will concatenate on the rows, meaning stacking vertically. So let's take a look at an example. So we have a data frame here of waitlisted students for our math class with the same exact column names, same exact data, and same column orders. So let's concatenate math class with waitlist on the rows, so performing a union query. So pandas.concat, pass through a list. I want the math class data frame on top, so we'll add that first. And then waitlist on the bottom, add that second. And then access equals 0 is the default, but we'll specify that just for this line of code. Run that cell, and here's our output. So from, looks like we have these students here are coming from the math class, and then on the bottom here we have these students who are added from the waitlist data frame. And we can add an additional argument here if we want this index to be continuous from 0 to n-1. You can see it is going to preserve the original index from the data frame. So we can pass through ignore index equals true, and now we'll get a brand new index. Okay, so now let's add some keys to that line of code to show which data frame each row comes from. So I'm just going to copy this line of code. It's a good starting point. And now I'm going to add in this keys argument, and we need a list. So I want to be able to create a column which will tell us where the data comes from. So our identifier for the math class data frame is we will call these students enrolled. So these are strings. And then next, for the waitlist data frame, we will say waitlisted. And you can't actually run, we need keys, not key. We can't run keys if ignore index equals true. It's not going to work. Not an error, but it's just not going to show your keys. So we can either change this to false, or ignore index equals false is the default. So we can just go ahead and delete that. So run that line of code, and now we have this additional index here, which tells us where each row is coming from. And we can do a little extra code here to create our columns. So let's reset the index. And I only want to reset the level. This is a multi-level index here, so level 0. So you can run that line of code, and then let's rename that column. This is a dictionary, so level 0, and we'll change that to the status. And then lastly, to get that brand new index, we can, let's use the slash here, send this to the next line, and say reset index, and this time we want to drop the old one. So drop equals true. And there's our nice clean data frame, and there's a look at the code again. Okay, so now let's try to understand exactly how pandas.concat is working. So the column names must be the same in order for these to function properly, but the column order doesn't matter. So let's take a look at a couple examples to demonstrate that. So first, let's change the order of these columns. So this is just going to rearrange the columns of our waitlist data frame. So now we have name, student ID, and semesters completed, as opposed to student ID and then followed by name. And if we run this same pandas.concat, I'm not going to include the keys this time. We'll just pull that part of the code, axis equals 0, and we'll pass through the ignore index equals true. Now we'll comment this back out so we don't get that order changing again. And we're still going to get that exact same output, so no problem there. So really what Pandas is doing here is it's matching exact column names. So if we comment this out now, let's actually copy that again. And now let's rename a column so that we don't have an exact match. So let's change our waitlist column from student underscore ID to student ID. So I'll run that line of code. Then let's copy or comment that out, paste our concat back in, uncomment that. And now if we run this, Pandas is not recognizing that data from this column and this column is actually the same. So it's going to add this extra column over here on the right. So we don't have any data here for student ID all squashed together coming from our math class table. So these are all going to be null values. And then the same is true for the opposite here in the waitlist table. So let's go ahead and change this back. Let's just flip these around. Comment that out again. And now our output is correct. So if you have these extra columns where they're not matching, then Pandas is simply going to add those off to the right of your output. So if you want to get the correct output, you have to make sure those column names are exact matches. All right, so now let's try an example with axis equals 1. So I'm going to pull back in this line of code here. We'll get rid of ignore index. And this time, if we say axis equals 1, this is going to match the indices. So the index 0 coming from our math class table is going to match with index 0 coming from the waitlist table. And so it doesn't matter that these names and student IDs are completely different. All it's doing is matching on the index. So once we get down to index 4 here, we don't have any index 4 data for the waitlist table. So all this from index 4 and down is going to be null. So axis equals 0 is matching on column names. Axis equals 1 is going to stack horizontally, matching on the index. All right, and now for the third and final section of this tutorial, which is going to be joining on multiple columns. So you don't always have a unique identifier or one single primary key in a table. And this is an example of that. So we have some football players, some current and some former, their first and last name, and the position they played. And then I have a stats data frame here, so the same 7 players and their stats for any given Sunday. So first, let's only join on the first name and then the last name and see what the problem is with our output. So pandas.merge, players on the left, stats on the right. we have the same 7 players in both tables, so it doesn't matter what type of join we run, but the on argument will matter. So if we join on first name, and this is the exact column name in both tables, so we can use on, and we run this, we're going to get some problems. So this, we don't output an error, but you can see rows like this here, where the first name Calvin is not unique in our tables. So we have Calvin Johnson and Calvin Ridley, and Pandas is simply going to match all instances of that first name Calvin. So we get a row like this, where Calvin Johnson is matched to Calvin Ridley. And we'll get a similar problem if we join on only the last name, where we have Andre Johnson here matched with Calvin Johnson here because we have that same last name. So instead, we have to create our own kind of primary key with multiple columns. So we need to join on both the first and last names because that will create a unique identifier for our players. So we'll use pandas.merge, the same 2 data frames, players and stats. And this time for the on argument, we're going to pass through a list. So we want to join on first name and the last name. And now this will give us the correct output. So passing through that list will allow you to join on multiple columns. All right, so now I'm going to change this up a little bit, and we'll change the names of those columns. So we're not going to be able to use the on argument anymore because we're not going to have exact matches when we run this line of code. And now let's perform that same join with our new circumstances. So players on the left, stats on the right, and just like with joining on one column, we can do the same thing with 2 columns. So we'll use left on and pass through a list. So the left table is players, and our column names are going to be first and last. These are the new column names. And then right on are the columns we want to join on for the stats table, our right table. And that will be first name and last name. Run that line of code, and there is our correct output. And again, you'll get those duplicate columns here, but you can always go back and drop those later on. So that is the end of the tutorial today. Please leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel for a lot more of this type of content in the future. As always, thanks for watching.